This is National Educational Television, a program distributed by the Educational Television and Radio Center.
We've come a long way these last weeks since we first picked up the threads of this story of colonial North America back in medieval Europe. As a matter of fact, 3 centuries have elapsed, 3 centuries of history, as week by week we saw those threads and others woven into a most interesting pattern of human achievement and human accomplishment. Now, we promised to tell you the story of colonial America before there was a USA. There is a USA now in our story. However, before we go on to a study of that further story, I think it'd be well if we'd take a few moments and go back over the road. You know, I think you have the same feeling. It's very pleasant after a trip to sit down in an armchair, after the grinding miles and the dust and the fatigue of the road, and retrace that trip. It's also a good idea in human affairs to stop occasionally and total up and check over things. That's why I propose in this discussion to say a few things about what we can call the legacy of the colonial centuries. You'll remember way back in the first program, it was in the last decade of the 15th century, and a certain Christopher Columbus rather suddenly dumped in the lap of the Queen of Spain, the Queen of Castile, a new world. At least he thought it was new, and at the moment, Spain and Spaniards thought that they had something else. Columbus thought so too. Columbus thought that he had discovered an all-water route to the Indies. But very swiftly, as the years went by, it became quite evident to everybody but Columbus that he hadn't touched off the shores of Cathay or of Cipangu, that he was very, very far away from the Spice Islands and the great mart of Calicut. It was pretty evident that he had discovered something new. Oh, it wasn't exactly new. Men had been in the Americas for many, many centuries before Columbus ever touched it. But it was new and exciting to the Europeans. Now, this was a source of disappointment to Spain. And before that 15th century was out, Spain had been outmaneuvered in her race for the Indies by her neighbor Portugal. And so about all that was left to her was to sit back and resign herself with these new lands in the West and to make the best of it. They didn't seem to promise very much. And then something happened. In 1519, Cortez discovered the very, very rich kingdom of the Aztecs and conquered it. About a decade and a half later, Francisco Pizarro, down South American way, he and his fellows discovered and conquered an equally rich kingdom, the kingdom of the Incas. Overnight, as it were, the new world began to loom in Spanish eyes as a rich jackpot. Now, immediately after these early finds, other conquistadores, Coronado de Soto, Quesada, dozens of others, began to rush madly around the New World, looking for or trying to run down rumors of kingdoms that were even more golden than either Mexico or Peru. We know that they covered a lot of territory. They learned a lot about North and South America, but they didn't find an Otro Mexico. They didn't find 7 golden cities. They didn't find a gilded man or even a reasonable facsimile thereof. So the Spaniards settled down. After they had scooped up the wealth that the Indians had accumulated over the course of centuries, they did just exactly what the Indians had done. They went to gather more wealth, but by the process of hard work. Now don't be misled. The Spaniards, the conquistadores, did not do the work themselves. After all, they were conquerors. So they drafted the poor Indians, the Native Americans, or they imported Negro slaves from Africa. In all events, as the years went by, the wealth of the Americas began to be exploited. They exploited American subsoil and drew out thousands and thousands of pounds of gold and silver. They exploited the American topsoil. They found that European crops could be acclimated here, or old world crops, let us say, could be acclimated here. They found certain new world crops, and wealth came from the topsoil. They pastured their flocks and their herds on American plateaus and American plains. Year by year, the wealth mounted. And the Spaniards more or less reconciled themselves to the fact, it was a rather pleasant fact now as far as they were concerned, the pleasant fact that Columbus had not discovered the East after all. Now, Spain in general asked for nothing more than to be left alone to enjoy her good fortune. But this was not to be. Almost as soon as she had hit her first American jackpot in Mexico, her arch enemy, France of the Valois, got wind of her good fortune. Now, in very short order, the French and other of Spain's rivals and enemies began to go into the business of hijacking her homebound treasure fleets. Before very long, some of them began to come clear over into the American waters, into the Caribbean, along the Spanish Main, at the Florida Straits. Then another day came, and her rivals began to plot her ruin not only in the Americas, but also in Europe. Now, about this time, a certain number of new factors had entered into the picture. These were factors that grew out of the religious disagreements that had shaken Europe earlier in that century. And before very long, Spain found herself facing what historians have called an embattled Protestantism, with the Catholic power thrown in here or there to add up to the total. In general, the Protestant cause was headed by England, and the Dutch were not far behind. Finally, in exasperation, Philip II, as we'll recall, decided to send his invincible armada to the north to deal sternly with his own and with the enemies of Catholicism. We know the sequel. A fortuitous storm in the Downs, and England's famous sea dogs, Drake and Hawkins and the rest of them, intercepted the Spanish fleet and defeated it rather disastrously. Thus ended, as far as Europe was concerned, the possible threat of Spanish hegemony in the West. Now, this defeat of the Armada, as we mentioned some weeks back, this defeat of the Armada had certain very important American consequences. Spain may not have been broken, but she was seriously crippled. And from here out, it would no longer be possible for her. She didn't have the strength to validate her claims, her monopoly claims to the New World. From here out, she was going to have to stand by and watch trespassers come into what she felt was her America. Now, it was just toward the end of the 16th century that various of these other powers began to become empire-minded. England and France and the Dutch. Now, in the case of some of them, they decided that they should have an empire overseas. You know, it's a rather interesting thing. Nations as well as individuals are sometimes caught by that feeling of necessity of keeping up with the Joneses. For example, France began to feel Spain has an empire overseas, Portugal has an empire overseas. Does that make them any better than France? It certainly shouldn't, because France, la belle France, you know, is so much better than they. We must have an empire. And the English thought the same thing. At other times, the motives for founding colonial empires, the motives were of such a character that they recommended themselves to the leaders of the countries as possible solutions to various of the domestic problems. For example, remember what we said when we discussed English colonization? Even though they were wrong, English leaders at the time thought that England was overpopulated and were very happy to see Englishmen go out across the Atlantic in order to drain off what they considered was the surplus population at home. Now, in all of these cases, among the French, among the English, among the Dutch, oh, to a lesser degree among the Dutch, it's perfectly true, they, pardon, they had a number of their own people who were regularly willing to risk either fortune or risk life or limb in order to come to the New World with the hope of greater freedom, of greater prosperity, of greater security, or of enhancing their position. Now, they moved almost at once. But actually, it was England who made the first permanent settlement at Jamestown in 1607. It was only a year after that France laid the basis for her empire by placing her capital at Quebec. A few years later, the Dutch were on the Hudson, and a couple decades later, the Swedes tried their hand at the Delaware. Now, before the 17th century was out, Spain had two rather mighty rivals in North America. For example, the English, by this time, their colonies extended from Maine on down to the Carolinas. And in the next century, they drive a wedge in between the Carolinas and Spanish Florida, the Georgia colony. France, for example, had established herself on the St. Lawrence. France had moved out into the lakes region and exploited the fur trade. They had lived through the period of Iroquois opposition, and then had begun an expansion westward. In the 18th century, from the mouth of the Mississippi up to the prairie provinces of Canada, Frenchmen began to establish themselves through mid-continent. Now, during this time, both France and England had picked up a certain number of small islands in the Caribbean. They picked them up largely as sugar islands or as bases to be used against Spain in time of war. Now, as each of these empires dug deeper and deeper roots, the respective mother countries began to feel that the whole continent should be theirs. Soon there were frictions, and frictions led to war. Over a period of 3/4 of a century, England and France were the prime contestants in this battle. They punched and they feinted, and at times Spain was drawn in. Then came the final showdown, the French and Indian War, shortly after mid-century. And England, as we know, knocked out her rival, and France withdrew from North America. England was also at the same time fighting a very important fight in India. And as of 1763, England found herself with vast territories in North America the whole of the eastern half and the whole of Canada. And she also had an extensive empire in the east in India. Now, the effort in gaining and winning this victory was such that England needed she needed a breather. And she also very readily saw that she had to reshape her policies. She had to reshape her policies in order to fit added responsibilities and very particularly added financial burdens. Now, as England began to set up what is known as a new colonial policy, it had certain consequences which her leaders did not foresee. 13 of her seaboard colonies decided to disagree with some of these policies, particularly of a fiscal nature. When England refused to listen to their complaints, they finally took the bit in their teeth, and as we saw in our last discussion, they declared their independence, that they, of right, ought to be free and independent states. There was a USA. Now, before beginning to tell the story of that USA, let's look backwards for something else. We've run through very rapidly, along the high spots, we've run through the history. Let's look back and see what this young USA would have by way of legacy, a legacy that had come to it from the colonial centuries. Now, the young USA was going to be only one of a group of American children that the European mother countries had brought into being in the Americas. Before they ended up, there would be 22 Americas. 18 had come from Spanish, or would have come from Spanish origin, one from Portuguese origin, namely Brazil. There would be 2 of Anglo origin, namely our USA and Canada. Now, the mother countries gave certain things which we might call a common legacy to all these Americas, and the United States participated in it. Now, probably the most important element of this common legacy is Western civilization. Now, this Western civilization is a combination of several elements. It's been in process for a long time, even before it comes across the Atlantic. For example, there is a Greek element, there's a Roman element, there's a Christian element, and there is a barbarian element. Let me explain them just very briefly. Well, I got down to the end without the chalk breaking. This sets something of a record. All right, the Greek. Now, in general, you can give whole courses on this. What we have to do is hit it in, I guess, a minute or so. From the Greeks, for example, the Western world is going to get its, well, let's call it its mind cast. In other words, the mind of the West is going to be poured into this Greek mold. The Greeks give us our, the basis of our philosophical search for truth. They give us attitudes toward our fellow men, humanism, and so on and so forth. They develop magnificent literary and artistic patterns. For example, colonial architecture, particularly house architecture, to a very large extent, is inspired by the Greek, just an example. But the Greeks developed the intellectual. The Romans come along, and in their very practical way, they contribute. In other words, they take these Greek ideas and make them work, and add certain things like Roman law, Roman administrative skill, and so on. Then out of the East comes the Judeo-Christian tradition, the religious tradition, which more or less infuses and impregnates this culture, gives it a certain body of truth and ethic, and so on. And then as time goes on, as you know, the barbarian peoples, the Germanic peoples from the north, swept into the Roman Empire and put the Roman Empire out of business. In the process, much of the old civilization was lost, but much was saved. And these barbarians, fusing at times with the existing Roman populations, and at other times maintaining their own, might say, ethnic integrity, they little by little have these influences from antiquity brought in upon them. They're Christianized, they're Romanized, so to speak, then Christianized, and out of it you have the European and you have a culture and civilization. Now, in this culture and in this civilization, which we call Western, among other things, man gets a pattern of life. In that, man, see, in that whole setup, man is a creature with a divine origin and with a divine destiny. And he has a dignity because of this situation which sets him above all other visible creation. That's the basis. That's the basis for the attitude which we Americans have toward the individual. The individual is sacred. The individual has a dignity. As the early fathers of the United States put it in the Declaration of Independence, man has a certain number of unalienable rights. You can't say that about the animal kingdom. You can't say that about anybody but man. That comes from the West. That's part of the heritage. And more than that, Western man also has in this heritage, through the Judeo-Christian tradition, he has a certain sure guide. He has divine revelation to keep his erring reason from going astray as reason can. He has answers that tell him whence he came, why he's here, how he is to act, and whither he is going. That's one of the great things in the colonial legacy that was passed over by Europeans to these children, so to speak, these young nations. They didn't necessarily intend them, but these young nations that are growing up in the new world. Now, besides that, the old world gave to the new a culture that was the result of centuries of human achievement, human development, a literature, an art, a metaphysic, and so on, which is kind of a high-powered word for a philosophy. You know, if you want to astound your friends, use the dip into the 6-bit barrel and come up and say, oh yes, the metaphysic of this, and so on and so forth. You know how it is. Just amaze them. Now, the old world gave to the new something else. It gave a whole body of institutions, experimentation that had gone on for centuries in matters political, in matters economic, how man could lead his economic life, how man could lead his social life, how he could lead his religious life. The old world gave to the new, besides, a heritage of accumulated experience, of techniques and skills. All this is extremely valuable. This was to the Americas in general. England, or the Anglo legacy, included a number of very special things. For example, from the Englishmen, our young United States, or the people of our young United States, received sort of a down-to-earth, a practical outlook on life. We Americans are not terribly given to theory. We would much rather see theory put into practice and be the ones who put it into practice. That's part of our nature, part of our genius. And coupled with this down-to-earth turn of mind is a very definite respect for hard work. We're not afraid to roll up our sleeves. We're not afraid to get our hands dirty. And it looks as though I'm proving that tonight myself. But at any rate, when the Anglos came, they didn't have anybody to work for them. They had to pitch in. They had to clear their fields, they had to fell their forests, they had to fish their waters, and so on and so forth. And all this passed on. From colonial times, from New England, came a certain Yankee appreciation of such thing as thrift and industry, the idea of working hard, another characteristic that runs all through the subsequent history of the USA. Then there's this great love of the land, the tremendous love of the land. In other words, the USA starts out, and it has a considerable amount of land up here to the Mississippi. Then, little by little, pushed by this desire to have more land, more fertile land and the like, the frontier line, as we know, little by little worked through the Trans-Mississippi, crossed the Rockies, went through the Great Basin, crossed the Cascades, and ultimately went over to the shores of the Pacific. This love of the land, something that the USA had inherited from colonial times. Then, not to be overlooked, the tremendous legacy, or part of the legacy, representative government. This was part of England's gifts. And we have used it to a very magnificent degree. The whole story of the USA is that. Then it was accidental rather than by design. We were given a great training in self-sufficiency these decades when England was so busy that she couldn't take care of us. These decades of salutary neglect. That prepared us for the job ahead. Now, enriched with all these, the young USA was prepared to attack its problems, and now the 13 colonies were no longer children. They no longer had a mother country to plan, to protect, even to boss. They had to do these things for themselves. Now, that is another story that we will be able to tell you. Now, before we sign off, let me just make one suggestion as to, I could make many, but you'll see why I make just one suggestion as to readings. Remember way back in the early programs, we said something about our favorite author. Well, I'm going to come back to him tonight. And here he is, The History of the Americas, the first volume. Now, in that, what we've tried to do is to put down the story. If you'd like to review it, you'll find in the chapters of this book, I'd say an excellent book, a little prejudiced, you'll find that much of what we have said is there. So there is a USA, and we'll sign off thanking you for your support and hoping that we'll be able to tell the story of the young USA, and that's it. Thank you.
The preceding program was distributed by the Educational Television and Radio Center. This is National Educational Television.